Cool. 203, we can get going. So thank you everybody for joining. Welcome to the first of many weekly webinars every single Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We are going to run a webinar about topics important to you all, important to ESG, investor relations, general counsels, mostly on the topic of climate, obviously, a little bit of climate risk. We'll talk about a few categories. We'll have investors on. We'll have actually, I'm working on bringing in a firefighter to talk about how to protect employees in times of disasters like what's going on in LA. There'll be a lot going on. But today we're going to talk about an introduction to the TCFD. So I believe you guys can see my screen, I hope. I'll say throughout this event, please chime in, ask questions. I see the Q&A tab going, so keep that going. That is very important. That is how we will make this awesome and interactive. And that'll be super helpful. And so this will be recorded. So I see somebody had to drop off because they forgot about a one-on-one, but this will be recorded if anyone needs it. So here's how we're going to do this. So we're going to have a couple sections here. We'll talk about who am I and why are we talking about this. We'll talk about the history of the TCFD, what's actually required from this, from the TCFD, or for what is the folks here who know what they're talking about, IFRS S2 now. Some of the early success and the story and how it's being brought into regulation and where this is going in the future of this disclosure, and then as well as a little bit about how Beehive helps and what's going on. Hello to the couple people who just joined. Good to see you, everybody. So let's get into it. So quick introduction. Who am I? So my name is Adriel. I'm the founder of Beehive. Beehive, we help companies with their enterprise climate risk management, which for the most part, we help you do all the physical transition risk work and then write the disclosures you need to comply with TCFD related disclosures. Let's talk about the TCFD and a little bit of history. So the TCFD was launched by something called the Financial Stability Board. Anyone here in the ESG universe knows we're going to get a bit of acronyms here. There'll be more acronyms at the end of this presentation, but also less. There'll be more, but less. So that's the universe here. So Mark Carney, who's the chair of the Financial Sustainability Board, he was the chairman of the Bank of England, as well as the Bank of Canada, I think the governor of the Bank of Canada, and also a theoretical nominee to take over Trudeau's seat as the Prime Minister of Canada. So he's really involved. He launched this work, and there's a couple interesting things here and quotes I'd like to point out, all the way dating back to 2015, so 10 years ago. So they assigned this task force on climate-related financial disclosures, and I like this quote a lot, where he talked about access to high-quality financial information will allow market participants and policymakers to understand and better manage these risks, which are likely to grow with time. And that's fairly prescient. He talked about how important it is for investors and regulators just to get disclosure around how these risks impact companies today. And there's two sides to this. There is, how are you impacted by climate risks, which natural disasters, the fires going on in Los Angeles right now are estimated at the high end to cause $275 billion in economic loss. And that's just insured economic loss. Obviously, a much higher number of uninsured loss. These are huge, huge numbers. And all he was saying by creating this TCFD is the importance of actually disclosing this information to help policymakers and investors. Michael Bloomberg, who we all know as the former mayor of New York, the founder of Bloomberg and the former presidential nominee, had a nice quote here too, where provided the full support. And there we go. So he talks about it is critical that industries and investors understand the risks posed by climate change. And currently, there's too little transparency about those risks. So again, all he was saying was something fairly non-controversial, which is investors want to know what happens if there's a hurricane. Is that bad for you? Is it irrelevant for you? Is it a little bad, a lot of bad? Is it worse for you than for your peers because you have bad insurance or because you've built no resilience measures? We just want to know that and price that into our disclosure efforts. Last thing here, but they define these three categories of risk, and they got it 2/3 right 10 years later, which is not bad. So they talk about physical risks, which is what is the impact of a hurricane to you. They talked about liability risks, which is what is the impact of a lawsuit that comes from climate-related issues. And then they talked about transition risks. So what are the risks to your reputation, to you not adapting to a changing market, to there being regulations you are out of compliance with. And they got that pretty right. Today, we'll talk a little about this. Liability got dropped, but physical risks and transition risks are still in there. And they talk about policy technological risks as highly relevant. So thought they did a pretty good job there. 2 years later, after this task force did its initial bit of work, they came out with the first recommendations of the task force for climate related financial disclosures. And they came out with quite a bang. So in 2017, they had this nice announcement that 237 companies with a combined market cap of $6.3 trillion are all in support of the TCFD. And I always love seeing companies saying, yeah, give me this. Yeah, make me do this. Because when a regulator comes in and says, eat your vitamins, and every company says, we don't actually think that's good for us, there's a lot of debate and a lot of fighting. But when a regulation is proposed and companies say, yes, like we are trying to find better ways to communicate this information to our investors, this is going to be valuable for us, like was said here by $6.3 trillion across 230 companies coming in here. And by the way, only half of these are financial firms, which is really important. Half of these are investors who want this data. And the other half are the companies who are doing this work. That's really, really valuable. So that's how this actually got started. So let's talk about what the actual requirements of the TCFD are, how it's evolved, what's come together. And by the way, Q&A is open, chat is open. You can drop things in as it goes along. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures came up with some recommendations, and there's 4 sections, 11 questions that they recommend that you answer. The 4 sections are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. We're not going to talk about all these in depth on this session. We'll do that at another time. But governance is basically what does your board and management do to oversee these risks? Strategy is describe what risks and opportunities exist. What is the financial impact of these risks? And do you have a resilient strategy, or are there real risks that we as investors need to understand? Risk management is basically like prove that this is legit. What is your process for identifying this? What is your process for managing this? And how are these integrated into your overall risk management? And question 8 here, disclosure number 8, I think is really essential because you'll find as you begin this TCFD work, a lot of the effort is, and you'll see this in a lot of reports, I'll actually point out, is lines like we are trying to move climate into our enterprise risk management strategy. It's not a thing that happens over there. It's not a side activity of the ESG team or fine, we hired a sustainability intern, they're going to deal with it. Climate is a material financial risk, and it should be treated just like other material financial risks, like geopolitical risks or cybersecurity risks or fraud risks or government and governance and like executive transition risks. All those are really essential. And the last couple categories are what metrics do you pay attention to? Do you disclose your emissions and what are they? And then what targets do you subscribe to? So those are the categories that we're going to look at. What these reports actually look like at the end, some of them are very fancy. So HubSpot, this is theirs, and these are public. You can find them or send me a note and I'll send them to you. They made it very nice. And so they, answered all these questions here, but then they gave a lot of context as to the scenario analysis that they did, as to the different sources where they got this information. Because again, this is a investor facing disclosure. You need to be very confident in your sources and the audit trail that got you there. And they talked about their risks. They have a high likelihood in the short term of supply chain delays, a high likelihood in the short term of relocation and higher operational costs. So they made it very nice. Another example is Take-Two Interactive. They're like a large video game company. Again, beautiful, well-designed, really sophisticated, a lot in here. They answered each question in part. You see the strategy section, you see the governance section, further down is the risk management section, and then the metrics and targets section. But they really gave a lot of transparency. And some companies choose to do something a little bit simpler. So this is GitLab, boxes, sections, question, answer, question, answer. Some of these are a little longer. So if you look at the first question of strategy, they give you a little more context as to physical and transition risks. And the second question, they kind of talk specifically about market and reputation risks and opportunities around resilience in the market. But question, answer. And then Pinterest is a very similar format, fairly straightforward question, answer. So I see a question in here. Does SB 261 necessitate producing a separate TCFD report, or can we include the physical and transition climate risk language in our existing report? answer live. It's a new feature there. So yes, you can put this SB 261 specifically says it just needs to be publicly available on your website. I'll pull this up here. And if we look at, I wonder if this is the right thing to search here. It needs to be available on your internet website. It needs to be accessible. And so some companies choose to put this as an appendix to their report. Some companies choose to do this as a standalone report. I'd say I've seen 60% of companies create this as an appendix in an impact report or sustainability report or ESG report. About 40% of companies do this as a standalone report. An example of a standalone report is Zendesk. Zendesk came out, I think, in May or April of last year, standalone report. An example of a TCFD index is Atlassian. Atlassian has this sustainability report from last year. Theirs is very, very long, so it takes a while to download. But once it does, and when we control F TCFD here, and we go to the planet, there you go. It's in the appendix. Here's our task TCFD recommendations, and they talk about this in the appendix. So good question. What I think this is moving towards is actually going to be more and more in the appendix. And I think this will be, you actually see some regulations, such as the Australian sustainability rules, as well as CSRD, that is pushing for this to be on the same cadence as annual financial regulations. And so maybe it should be part of a 10K. Maybe it should be an addendum in traditional financial disclosure. So I suspect it'll be more and more common to put this in an appendix, but either of those is fine. Good question. So there's those sample reports. Again, we have this blog post here. You can just Google understanding the TCFD Beehive climate or look in our blog section, and there's some advice about how to answer any of these questions with some examples, and so you can check that out. So the TCFD was super successful. So let's talk a little about that. Every single year since 2017, I think, they put out this like status report. And the most recent one was in 2023. And they said, how are we doing? Like, is this working? Does the market care about it? Do investors care about it? Do our companies complying? Are we talking, screaming into screaming to deaf ears? What's happening here? And I think they did such a good job being so transparent here. And again, you can Google TCFD status report for 2023, or I can share the link later if you want it. But I pulled out a few examples of how they're doing a good job here. Let me make this a little bit larger. But some success that they talked about. So they did a review of results from 2020 to 2022. The number of disclosures per company is increasing. The number of questions people are answering is increasing. You'll see a while ago, 0 people answered all 11 questions. In 2022, I suppose, 4% answered all 11 questions, but the number of companies answering this average, call it 60% of questions, is going up really, really quickly. I mean, it tripled, more than tripled in these 2 years. And I think all the reports that I see, probably like 9 or 10 out of the 11 questions are answered from reports that came out in 2023 or 2024. There's the obvious next question here of like, for SB 261, do I need to answer all 11 questions? What happens if I don't? The way the rule is written today is basically best of your ability. We want to see good faith efforts. I think if you are able to provide some sort of useful answer to all the questions, then you should do so. If you are unable to provide that kind of context, then you're able to say, we plan on answering this next year, or this is on our docket to do better review of, or leave it blank and you'll be okay. But I think make the best faith effort to do a good job here. Another interesting thing here is disclosure by industry. This is in 2022. You'll see it's fairly high across energy, which makes a lot of sense, materials and building, banking, these are places where you might say, obviously, climate risks are really material. But I think most people here, not all, are in the tech industry. Over 40% of disclosures or over 40% of technology companies who have answered these things are talking about governance. Over 60% of them are talking about metrics and targets. Where you see a big gap currently in the technology industry is in this like middle section of strategy and risk management, because these are difficult. It is difficult to do a physical risk assessment if you have employees all over the world. It is difficult to understand, to quantify your exposure to regulatory risk. That's difficult stuff. So in 2022, of the tech companies who responded, only 5% of them, for example, talked about resilience. Of the population who was actually covered here, which I think this covered like 200 or 300 companies of all that disclosed. So it's not a full body here, but not bad. Disclosure by company size is always interesting. Currently, SB 261 is written that any company with over $500 million in global revenue who's headquartered in the United States and any state in the United States or DC and does business in California, which is a currently undefined but likely very, very low threshold, has to do this. These companies aren't huge. I think the average application, average market size on this call, just taking a quick look, is probably 2 billion ish. So that puts you in here. But of the companies with less than 3 billion in market cap, they're answering a lot of these questions. Obviously, the larger you get, the more material these risks get, and the more resources you have. And yeah, someone asked if I could share the slides. I'll definitely share the slides. But they're answering, call it 40% on average of these questions, maybe a little bit higher. So that's the expectation. This is very common in Europe. More European companies are reporting than any other geography. But in North America, it's also fairly high, specifically in the United States. So about 1,000 companies, 1,100 companies, almost 12 in the United States reported. I think this is between 2020 and 2022. A couple hundred tech companies, many banking companies, and some of the other industries you might expect. So that's a bit about like the success of the TCFD. And there's this quote from Michael Bloomberg in that same report that I really like, that the success of TCFD recommendations can be demonstrated by the 19 jurisdictions accounting to close to 60% of global GDP with final or proposed disclosure requirements. Additionally, the TCFD has seen over 4,800 organizations indicate their support for these recommendations. That's really powerful. That's them saying it's not about an agenda. It's not even about saving the planet and corporations doing their part. This is just saying companies are really taking to it. Regulators all over the world see a lot of value in it, and investors really, really like it. So that's some of the success there. Talking about regulations, this is a question that often comes up. There's a really useful map, and again, I'll share this afterwards, of where climate risk regulations currently exist right now. You'll see in effect is this dark blue, so California SB 261. You'll see this is the CSRD. China's got these rules. This actually expired. Australia, now this should be dark blue. I think this is not fully updated. Brazil has these rules. The UK has had this for a few years, which makes sense because Mark Carney was the chairman of the Bank of England. Actually didn't know this, but Nigeria has these rules, and some of these companies affect businesses headquartered there, but some of them, like CSRD, impact companies who do a certain amount of business in that jurisdiction. So just because you say you are an American company, even if you do no business in California, which is not true for anyone here, and probably not true for any American company of a significant size, if you do business in Europe, if you do business in Brazil, if you do business in China, you may be impacted by this. So something for you to explore. So let's talk in the last couple minutes here about the future. What has changed? Well, 2023 was the last year that the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Risk Disclosures, existed in its known format. So there's this LinkedIn post from a little over a year ago that said the TCFD has fulfilled its remit and disbanded. The TCFD remit was to set up these disclosures and create best practices and build international awareness from the investor community about the importance of disclosing this information. It did its job and it disbanded. Everyone was all up in a tizzy when this happened. Oh my God, it's all over. What do we do? It's actually a good thing. So what happened is it has been taken over by something called, I promise you more acronyms, the ISSB, which is part of the IFRS. I don't even remember what that slogan is. And what basically happened here is the IFRS, which is like trying to bring all these standards together and saying ESRS, CSRD, IFRS, TCFD, like it's absolutely insane. It's why everyone's annoyed at the ESG world. There's just too much stuff going on. How do we consolidate? So the IFRS adopted the rules of the TCFD and said, we are embracing these 11 disclosures. We are embracing all the work that they've done. This is not going away. If you've been aligned with the TCFD, you are almost fully aligned with IFRS S2. We just want to standardize these things because it took in information from a bunch of different climate risk disclosures around the world and bring them all together under one roof and push companies to go a little bit further. So the ISSB is basically about, I like this part here, there's a clarification of the alphabet soup of ESG initiatives. So we don't have to have multiple climate risk disclosure types. Every country on earth is beginning to, and California as well, is beginning to align with the IFRS S2. They even put that, where's my little, if we go back to the California law, Mr. Wiener and Mr. Stern were clever enough to write that your report must be aligned with the TCFD or any successor thereto. And actually, this came out a month before the TCFD disbanded, so they had some ESPN. I know that's not what it is, but Um, so the IFRS took it over, and there's a lot of overlap. I think this is actually a little bit dramatic of a representation. This is from Harvard Law School, so you think you can fully trust it, but then when you zoom in a little bit, you realize that this is actually ISS, which is a consulting company, saying the differences and the overlaps between IFRS S2. Obviously, the more differences, the more money a consultant makes from selling you services to understand the scary new thing. I think they're being a little dramatic. I would move the overlap quite a bit higher, but nevertheless, a lot of overlap. You see for most sections, 50% or more of like almost exact overlap with a few enhancements, and then some net new requirements across these things. And so some examples of these net new requirements are in governance. This stuff does not exist in the TCFD, but is asked for under IFRS S2. You want something like the percentage of executive remuneration recognized to climate considerations. Basically, do you have executive comp tied to climate targets? Around strategy, you might talk about the effects of investments on these things. So if you're making investments into adaptation, will that have a good financial impact on you? Around risk management is, have you done these risks, and are there substantial risks that you want to specifically talk about? So the TCFD is like, do the risks, period, or do the analysis, excuse me, period. This is saying, have you done it, and what risks have you identified? And then around metrics and targets, a lot of older reports use that section just to talk about carbon emissions. I think that's limited. Obviously, there's more metrics around resilience and the impact of climate disasters on your business, such as something like same store sales for a retail business. If a big hurricane closes down stores for 5 days, your same store sales drops by 3% on the year. That becomes an issue. For something like a software company, if you identify that you have 12% of your employees living in high risk areas, and that can create $1 million business continuity distraction each year, they basically want you to identify these metrics and then talk about tracking them a little bit. So that's a bit of story on the TCFD. So it's gone really far from 2015 to 2025 on its 10-year journey. It got created to bring transparency. Thousands of companies, first voluntarily, and now through the compliance efforts of over 19 jurisdictions, this has been brought into law. From SB 261 alone, just that California law, that is expected to impact 10,000 companies. 10,000 companies that are based in the United States, do business in California, and have a global revenue threshold of over $500 million. So it's a big, big group. That's another 50,000 companies under CSRD, and then Japan, Singapore, Brazil, Canada, UK, thousands and thousands more there that are being impacted. And so a lot has happened there. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions. I want to show you very briefly how Beehive helps with some of this. So on the physical risk side of it, this is really challenging because what you need to do is scenario analysis across multiple disasters across the whole world to understand where you have risks. And so what you can do in Beehive is add employees, offices, data centers, see risk from wildfires, see the same from floods, do so in global jurisdictions, see how that changes across multiple scenarios, like what if climate change is really bad in the long term or the medium term. So it makes that part of it really, really simple. You can set up governance structures. So we talked a little bit about this, where you'll be able to see, what committees have you created, who has climate risk oversight, of who have climate risk oversight, who has climate expertise. And so you can set that up. We do a bunch around transition risk that I'm actually going to dive into on a future webinar in a couple of weeks. And then writing this report normally takes a long time. Getting your first draft for the consultants takes 8 weeks. Often doing it yourself can take you many, many hours. And so with Beehive, you can come in here. We have a lot of information about you. We've trained AI on the rules of the IFRS or the TCFD. We've trained it on many, many peer responses from companies in your industry about what's good, what's bad, and actually write your first draft for you in a couple of minutes. And this is just the first draft. You're going to be improving it, but it gets you to that draft that you can go edit, improve, work on in a couple of minutes instead of waiting months and missing the deadline or having your general counsel yell at you that they had very little time to edit it before this needs to go into an impact report. So I'll pause there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Promise you this would be in under 30 minutes, and we just made it. Happy to answer any questions, talk about what your peers are doing, what challenges you guys have, how physical risk works, what's going on in the TCFD, anything like that. But any questions at all? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I appreciate this. We're gonna do this every single Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Next week is a whole session about setting up your corporate governance structure. So if you don't have an ESG steering committee yet, or if you have one and you're trying to figure out how to make it better, I think you'll really enjoy that. Thank you all for coming. I will send out a recording as well as slides and links after the call, and I'll see you all soon. Thanks.